When modern basketball fans say that Michael Jordan played against weak competition to dominate the 90s.
I'm sorry, I'm allergic to bullshit.
I'm here to tell you why that's such a misinformed take. You may be looking at me like, oh, look what this guy is wearing. He's gonna be so biased. No, I actually did my homework for this, so I'm gonna explain it to you year by year on who he faced in the playoffs and who he faced in the finals. It's so easy to just say that the competition weakened in the 90s just when you know that Michael Jordan didn't win in the 80s, and that's just being lazy. And being lazy is why you're misinformed if you actually believe such bullshit that Michael Jordan faced weak competition to win his 6 championships. Before we go any further, I also want to mention that Michael Jordan played in an era where hand checking was allowed, when there was no defensive 3 seconds, the paint was a lot more packed, there wasn't freedom of movement, and there was no such thing as a restricted area until his final season with the Bulls. If you want to talk about how zone defenses weren't allowed during that time, that didn't stop teams from disguising them. This video is already about to be long enough though, so if you want to learn more about that, I recommend Legend of Winning's video, Debunking Jimmy High Roller's video about defense in the 90s, which I'll link in the description. So before we get on with the show though, if you could please take a moment to consider dropping a like, that'd be really helpful. Also, if you could please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, your support is much appreciated. Also, if you want to follow me on social media, links are in the description for that too. I'll follow you back. Also, definitely feel free to get down in the comment section too. So let's get on with the show now. So Michael Jordan was drafted 3rd overall by a 27-win Chicago Bulls team that at the time was led by Orlando Woolridge, who many casual modern fans may have never heard of. He was a very good scorer, but his scoring didn't really translate to winning. He was too one-dimensional. That was why he wasn't on the Bulls after Michael Jordan's 2nd season on the team. But we won't really focus on him because we're here to focus mostly on Michael Jordan's competition. I won't just go over the finals though. I'll go through previous playoff rounds too. I will start with the 80s. In the 80s, how LeBron fans love to argue that LeBron never lost in the first round, something that you cannot say anymore after just this past season. Want to know a fun fact? Yes, I do have to bring up LeBron into this. For now, that the 2006 and 07 Cavaliers, yes, that 07 team that LeBron took to the finals, which many people say he carried to the finals, there may be some truth to that, but we're not really here to focus too much on that. Those teams would have been first round exits in the Western Conference. The 2008 Cavaliers wouldn't have even made the playoffs in the West. All that could be for a whole nother video, but just FYI, the Eastern Conference was a lot tougher in Michael Jordan's era than it has been since a lot of us, including myself, have been watching basketball. Michael Jordan's rookie year, 3 teams in the Eastern Conference won at least 58 games. The Celtics, the Bucks, and the 76ers. So the first round, the Bulls faced a 59-23 Milwaukee Bucks team that had 2 guys scoring over 20 points per game. Those were Sidney Moncrief and Terry Cummings. Sidney Moncrief was not only a great scorer, he also won Defensive Player of the Year twice. The Bucks swept the Bulls, and Terry Cummings happens to be the only guy to ever outscore Michael Jordan in a playoff series, but he didn't even outscore him by very much, although yes, he did outscore him a lot more efficiently. The 80s Bucks aren't talked about because they didn't achieve the ultimate goal of winning the championship. However, they were good enough to be on 2K. The next 2 years, the first of which Michael Jordan missed the majority of the regular season because he broke his foot, they would lose to Larry Bird's Boston Celtics. LeBron apologists are getting their you-know-what wet right now, aren't they? Because they won't acknowledge the much tougher competition that Michael Jordan was facing in the first round in the 80s. The 86 Celtics did sweep Michael Jordan's Bulls, but you want to know what else? They were a 67-win team, they won the championship, and that was the year that Larry Bird became the last player to three-peat as the MVP. They also had 2 other All-Stars in Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish, also a former Finals MVP, Dennis Johnson, another Hall of Famer, and Michael Jordan scored an NBA playoff record 63 points in Game 2. The Celtics also had Danny Ainge, a scrappy defender who can knock down the 3. We'll see him again later on as this video continues. The Bulls were 30-52 with Jordan missing the majority of the season, but Jordan was not one to take losing or tanking for an answer. Instead, he gave it his all when he came back from his foot injury. He scored 49 in Game 1, set an NBA playoff record 63 points in Game 2 that still stands to this day. Yes, he did fold in Game 3, but you can't deny that he did all that he can in Games 1 and 2, but his team just wasn't good enough. Now, Larry Bird, the leader of the Celtics team that Michael Jordan's Bulls just lost to 2 years in a row. Yeah, a lot of casuals will just look at him as he's just some white dude, right? Well, Larry Bird is one of the most skilled players of all time and also one of the most fierce competitors of all time. There's a reason why he's so highly regarded by his peers and those who actually watched him play. He wasn't as athletic as Jordan or LeBron, that may be true, but that does get very exaggerated too. He was able to dunk and averaged more minutes per game for his whole career than anyone is averaging this season. The Bulls got swept by that same Celtics team again the next year. Those Celtics won 59 games and lost to the Lakers in the finals. So you're getting it so far that the East was a whole lot tougher, aren't you? At least I hope so. So now we are on to 1988 to 1990. That was when the Bad Boys Pistons were Michael Jordan's Bulls' roadblock. Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Dennis Rodman. Not really much to say here because I think we know the story. For Jordan's Bulls, it was 1990 when Scottie Pippen became a legitimate co-star and also when Phil Jackson replaced Doug Collins as the head coach. That was also when the Bulls traded Charles Oakley to the Knicks for Bill Cartwright, which allowed Horace Grant to start at power forward. But here's where the fun really begins, because this was the beginning of the dynasty. When people say that the Pistons were old when the Bulls finally beat them,
Stop! No! Stop right there!
yeah, their core pieces were still under 30 years old. Isaiah Thomas missing nearly half the season because of a wrist injury. Okay, that is true, but he was not old. He was still 29 years old at the time. You could say that seriously affected his play, I will not deny that. He did struggle in the playoffs. However, Joe Dumars was still an all-star at 27 years old and Michael Jordan locked him up in the conference finals. Now on to the finals when the Bulls beat the Lakers. This may have been after Kareem Abdul-Jabbar retired. However, Magic Johnson was very much still in his prime. In fact, he was second to Jordan in MVP voting that year. Just because this was his last year before the HIV announcement which made him retire does not mean that he was just washed up. No, he was still in the MVP conversation. In fact, he was the MVP the 2 years before 1991. It's not like he just fell off a cliff in 1991. They also still had James Worthy, who was very much still in his prime. Byron Scott may have not been the 20 point per game scorer that he was a few years back, but he was still a very solid third option for the Lakers at the time. And then there was Sam Perkins and Vlade Divac, both who I find very underrated. Yes, Vlade was the guy the Lakers traded for Kobe in one of the most lopsided trades in NBA history. Yes, Vlade may be the guy that tapped the ball out to Robert Horry. He may be known as a really bad executive for the Sacramento Kings now. However, if he was such a bad player, he wouldn't have been in the league long enough to be able to slap the ball out to Robert Horry for Robert Horry's buzzer beater, wouldn't he? Because that was 11 years later. Now yes, James Worthy and Byron Scott both got injured in Game 4, but the Bulls already had a commanding lead at that point anyways, so you can't really point the finger at that for why the Bulls won. That was a series that the Bulls would have won regardless because they were just the better team at that point. Let's move on to 1992 now. A team casuals think were not that good even though this was their third year in a row of winning at least 57 games. The Portland Trailblazers. And they also just lost in the finals 2 seasons earlier. They had the second best shooting guard in the NBA behind Jordan and Clyde Drexler. But it didn't stop there as they had 6 guys averaging double digits that season. Their point guard, their floor general, Terry Porter was their second leading scorer with 18 points per game. He was a deadly shooter and he was an all-star the year before. Why didn't he make it in 92 despite averaging more points? Okay, on worse efficiency, but you can expect that with more shots, right? You know what else? Magic Johnson got to play in the All-Star game game. Despite being retired, he was able to come in as a special guest. Then there was also John Stockton, Tim Hardaway Sr. Dan Marley was in as a guard and forward. We will see him in this video later on. And also Jeff Hornacek. And yes, Jeff Hornacek averaged 20 points per game for a 53-win Suns team that year. You know who else didn't make it that year? Kevin Johnson. But I'm not even done with the Blazers yet. Jerome Kersey, who was a very good role player, who was in his 8th out of 11 seasons for the Blazers. Cliff Robinson was the 6th man of the year the following year. And Danny Ainge, who was on those Celtics teams I mentioned not that long ago that beat the Bulls in the 80s and was a 20 point per game scorer with the Kings after his Celtics days and before he joined the Blazers. Then there's also Kevin Duckworth, another guy who averaged double digits for the Blazers. The Blazers were so deep that Danny Ainge scored just under 10 points per game for them. The Blazers were the 3rd best defense in the NBA in 92, and Buck Williams was on the all-defensive second team while scoring 11 points per game. And the Bulls beat them in 6 games. 1993. The Bulls didn't even have the best record in the East, let alone the NBA. The Knicks and the Suns had better regular season records than the Bulls. I already did a video on the 93 Suns. I will leave a card on the top right part of the screen. I'll leave a link to that in the description, and I'll put that video in the end screen. I'll still talk about them a little bit though. So remember, I did just mention that Jeff Hornacek was a 20 point per game scorer on a 53-win Suns team. Basically what the Suns did was swap their top scorers with the Sixers. So they got Charles Barkley, pretty big upgrade, I know. But then there's also Kevin Johnson, Thunder Dan Marley, Danny Ainge, Tom Chambers, and Cedric Sabalas, all of who I really go in depth about in that video. The casuals don't want to talk about those guys because they just want to think that Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen only beat Charles Barkley, which is far from the truth. That was a damn good team that Jordan averaged 40 points per game against. So if you want to know more about that team, you can feel free to watch my video that I made about the 1993 Phoenix Suns. But I also want to focus on the New York Knicks too, because I never made a video about the old Knicks, and that was the Bulls' toughest competition in the Eastern Conference. They had Patrick Ewing very much in his prime. They also had John Starks a year away from being an all-star. I met him, by the way, him and Grandmama. Starks averaged 17.5 points per game for the Knicks in 1993. Starks was a fierce competitor and also a very scrappy defender that really made Michael Jordan work when he was assigned to guard him. Anthony Mason was 2 seasons shy of winning 6th man of the year himself. He averaged 12 points per game off the bench for the Knicks. And then there's 1994. We know the story. Michael Jordan retired after his dad was murdered and had an unsuccessful baseball stint. The Rockets beat the Knicks in the 94 finals. The Knicks team that was the Bulls' toughest opponent in the Eastern Conference in the last year, the first three-peat. So now 1995, when Michael Jordan came back to the Bulls, when the Bulls were just 2 games above 500 at the time and finished 47-35, they lost to Shaq and Penny's Orlando Magic in the 2nd round. Yeah, Penny Hardaway before injuries and Shaquille O'Neal. If that's weak competition to you, I'm baffled. Just as much as if you'd say anyone I previously mentioned is weak competition. Shaq was already averaging 29 points per game at this point, while Penny Hardaway was being compared to Magic Johnson at this point in his career before the injuries derailed him. Not to mention the Bulls lost Horace Grant to the Magic that season, so the Bulls had no inside presence. Also, how about the Orlando Magic's 3rd leading scorer, Nick Anderson, who averaged nearly 16 points per game? How many of the younger fans even know who he is? Or Dennis Scott, who averaged almost 13 points per game for the Orlando Magic. Then there's the historic 1995-96 season where the Bulls were 72-10. They brought in Dennis Rodman to fill in that void at power forward that Horace Grant left. They faced the Miami Heat in the 1st round and they were not a tough opponent. The Knicks' record was decent as they still had Patrick Ewing in his prime, but the Knicks were not very sharp in the second half of the 96 season, and the Knicks were 1-5 during a stretch where Ewing was out for 6 games. The Bulls beat them in the 2nd round, and this time, that same Orlando Magic team that beat the Bulls the previous year, the Bulls swept them in 96 in the conference finals. Yes, it's true that Horace Grant was injured this time around. However, However, the team still had Shaq and Penny. Now here we are with the NBA Finals. The Seattle SuperSonics with Gary the Glove Payton, the Defensive Player of the Year, and also great on offense too, both as a scorer and a facilitator. Shawn Kemp, an all-star at the time before alcoholism and weight problems derailed his career. He was a 6-time all-star. Since some of these guys want to say the competition was so weak, 19 points and 11 rebounds per game in 96. There's also Detlef Schrempf, a 3-time all-star. He was an all-star the year before and the year after 96. Why not in 96? He got injured and his competition was Charles Barkley, Shawn Kemp, Karl Malone, and also Sean Elliott. Sean Elliott was a very good player. Many people don't remember, but I won't really focus on him right now because we're here to focus on Michael Jordan's opponents.
You know, I think of Detlef Schrempf, I think of Hakeem Olajuwon, there's a Steve Nash. You know, obviously the foot-eye coordination necessary in soccer, I think it translates. Also, I think when you play soccer, it's not very individual. You play with other people. You see the field. And Detlef was a guy, obviously we're showing clips of his offensive talent, but you know, he was a guy that was a great passer, a great facilitator. He could score from outside. He was really strong and physical, could post you up. Just played the game the right way. And I know I played against him and he was just a matchup problem. But really skilled, saw the whole court. And I think a lot of that maybe had to do from his soccer, from his early age.
There's also Hersey Hawkins, an all-star back in 1991, the third leading scorer with 15.6 points per game on that Sonics team. Remember Sam Perkins from the 91 Lakers? Back then he was a starter. Now Sam Perkins is coming off the bench and he's a much improved three-point shooter. This Sonics team had the second best defense in the NBA right behind the Bulls, and the Bulls did manage to beat the Sonics in 6 games. Now, yes, if George Karl had decided to assign Gary Payton onto Michael Jordan from the get-go rather than after the team was down 3-0, yes, that definitely could have made a difference because Gary Payton actually held Michael Jordan under 40% when assigned to guard Michael Jordan. However, at the end of the day, that is a hypothetical. Either way, yes, Michael Jordan did beat a very talented Seattle SuperSonics team. 1997 and 98, the Bulls faced Karl Malone, John Stockton, and the Utah Jazz. But wait, that's not it. Remember Jeff Hornacek? I mentioned him earlier. He was the second scorer on that team, but the third best player. He was the second leading scorer as John Stockton was a pass-first point guard. Also, no, John Stockton is not someone who was just average without Karl Malone. I don't care what someone like Rusty Buckets says. Sure, Rusty Buckets is entitled to his own opinion. That doesn't mean I have to agree with it, and that's a notion that I totally disagree with. Now, while I don't consider John Stockton a top 5 point guard of all time, he's most certainly a top 10 point guard. And just because he wasn't flashy doesn't mean he wasn't great. The Jazz also had Brian Russell, and he was able to score in double digits. Also, Karl Malone won the MVP in 97. I'm not even going to comment on if Michael Jordan got robbed or not, which I know is a debate. But Karl Malone being the MVP that year, that's enough to say that no, the Bulls didn't just beat a weak team in the finals. Now, I have nothing good to say about Karl Malone, the person. However, the point I'm trying to make is that Michael Jordan facing weak competition is bullshit. And Karl Malone is one of many examples of that. Now, I could make this video a whole lot longer than it already is by talking about the Jazz road to the finals, so I'm just gonna keep it focused on the Bulls, although yes, the Jazz did beat some very tough teams on their way to both the 97 and 98 finals. So in the 97 playoffs, yes, the Bulls did breeze through the first round, but then the second round, they beat the Hawks in 5 games. The Hawks won 56 games behind Steve Smith's 20 points per game and were anchored by Defensive Player of the Year Dikembe Mutombo. Christian Laettner may be remembered as a great college player, the only non-Hall of Famer on the Dream Team, a bust in the NBA, but actually Christian Laettner's NBA career was not as bad as people make it out to be. In fact, it got off to a pretty good start. In 97, Christian Laettner was an all-star, averaging 18 points per game. The Hawks also had Mookie Blaylock averaging 17.4 points per game, and he led the league in steals that year, and he also made 6 all-defensive teams. In the 97 conference finals, the Bulls beat the Miami Heat, who had the top defensive rating that year and were led by Tim Hardaway Sr. and Alonzo Mourning. While Tim Hardaway was well known for his killer crossover, Alonzo Mourning, to me, gets very overlooked due to the era he played in because of of guys like Hakeem Olajuwon, Shaq, David Robinson, and Patrick Ewing also playing in his era. The Heat didn't have the best offense, but they did have the #1 defense that year, and the Bulls were able to beat them in 5 games. Now in '98, again, the New Jersey Nets you could say was a weak opponent for Jordan. The Charlotte Hornets though, they had Glenn Rice, who was an absolute sniper, and he scored 22 points per game. They also had Anthony Mason, a guy who I mentioned previously. He was on the All-NBA third team just the year before, and averaged a double-double in consecutive seasons. So the Hornets, while no, they weren't the toughest opponent that Michael Jordan ever faced, as they were a 51-31 team, and they were 11th in offense, 15th in defense. They certainly were not a bad team. Then we get to the conference finals where they faced Reggie Miller and the Indiana Pacers. The Pacers were 58-24. They were 4th in offense and 5th in defense. It wasn't just Reggie Miller though. They also had Rick Smits, who was another underrated center from the 90s. In fact, he was an all-star in 1998. And while Chris Mullin was declining at that point in his career, he was still good enough to be their 3rd leading scorer. Also, can't forget their floor general Mark Jackson, who's 5th all-time in career assists. Mama, there goes that man. That Pacers team was able to take the Bulls to 7 games. And then once again, the Bulls beat the Jazz in the finals. This time the Jazz had home court advantage, and the Bulls beat them in 6 games. The roster construction of the Jazz didn't really change much from the previous year. So in conclusion, this notion that Michael Jordan won against weak competition is complete utter bullshit, and it's disrespectful to Michael Jordan. I find it weird how it's only basketball where past generations get so diminished to uplift the current generation. This notion that past players were plumbers and janitors. I've never once heard anything that stupid ever used against someone like Babe Ruth or Bart Starr. It's only basketball where such bullshit gets spewed out. So if you want to call LeBron the GOAT, which is a take I don't agree with, but you're entitled to your own opinion if you do believe it, this could be for another discussion though. Maybe that could be the sequel to this video if the comment section here does get toxic enough. But just because you weren't around for that era, doesn't it all mean that that era was weak? Grow up. You can just say that you don't really know much about that era. I will respect that a whole lot more than just saying it was a weak era without really knowing much about it. A lot of these people who make these ignorant claims about Michael Jordan beating weak competition to win his 6 championships are obviously not old enough to remember Michael Jordan playing for the Bulls. And you know what? As mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not old enough either. I was born in 1993. I started watching basketball in 2001. But guess what? I did my homework. Now, am I saying that Michael Jordan ever faced a team as deep as the Warriors with Kevin Durant? No. I just wanted to make this video to tell all these Gen Z bots that no, Michael Jordan did not beat weak competition. When he lost to the Pistons 3 years in a row, he worked harder rather than give up on the team that he was currently on, and finally overcame that roadblock. Sure, a lot of those first round matchups during the dynasty years weren't very tough, but as they got deeper into the playoffs, yes, they got very tough. That's all I got for this video. If you made it this far, and if you haven't done so yet, if you could please take a moment to consider hitting the like button for the YouTube algorithm, subscribing if you're new, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss any of my future sports videos, that would be much appreciated. Also, definitely feel free to get down in the comment section and tell me what you think. And also, if you were old enough to remember Michael Jordan's Bulls, you can feel free to tell me anything I missed. Now, there's these 2 videos, one of them which I mentioned in the video, the 93 Suns video, and also this video up here that you can definitely feel free to check out as well, as this isn't just a basketball channel, although I will actually tell you this, that basketball is actually my favorite sport. But anyways, I just want to say, if you made it this far in this really long video, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.